It was a winter evening like no other when Garrett Hale's life was forever changed. He had just come from the graveside of his old friend, Thomas Brennan. The wind howled and the snow fell in thick sheets, covering the world in a blanket of white. But then, through the swirling snow, Garrett saw her, her white dress blending into the snow like a ghost. She was frozen, barely alive, her fingers stiff from the cold, clutching a letter. A letter bearing the name of Thomas Brennan, the man who had died just days ago. His heart raced as he rushed to her side, realizing that this woman, who should have arrived in the spring, had come far too early. And with her arrival, everything was about to change. What he did next changed everything. Garrett would later reflect. Little did he know, this frozen bride would turn his world upside down in ways he never saw coming. Garrett stood solemnly by Thomas Brennan's grave, the biting wind pushing against him. Thomas had been a close friend, a man Garrett had known since childhood. Now, the grave marked the end of a chapter in Garrett's life. As he stared at the freshly dug earth, a strange feeling of loneliness crept over him. 3 years had passed since his wife's death. The loneliness had been unbearable at times, but he had grown used to it. As Garrett lingered at the gravesite, the realization hit him. Thomas had been preparing for a new chapter in his own life. A mail-order bride was due to arrive soon, someone Thomas had been corresponding with for months. Garrett remembered how Thomas had talked about her in letters, how excited he was to have her join him in the spring. But now, with the storm raging and Thomas gone, Garrett assumed the woman would never come. She would never know the truth, that Thomas had passed away. But as Garrett turned to leave, he felt a pang of sadness. It was a reminder that life moves forward, even when we are left behind. He wiped a tear from his eye and turned his back to the grave, unaware that his life was about to take an unexpected turn. 3 nights later, a blizzard of epic proportions hit the valley. Garrett had been holed up in his cabin, stoking the fire and preparing for the worst. The storm raged outside, the wind shrieking like a living thing. He had always hated these storms, and tonight was no different. But just as he was about to settle in for a long, quiet night, there was a knock at the door. He hesitated, unsure if he'd imagined it. Then, another knock, louder this time. He opened the door, his breath catching in his throat. Standing there, barely visible through the snowstorm, was a woman. She was frozen, her face pale, her lips blue from the cold. She looked as if she had walked straight out of a nightmare. Garrett's heart skipped a beat as he rushed her aside. She was barely conscious, swaying in the wind. He helped her inside and quickly got her by the fire, stripping her of her wet clothes and wrapping her in blankets. She was in bad shape. Hypothermic, her body shivering uncontrollably. Her hands trembled as she clutched a bundle of letters, her fingers tight around them as though they were the only things keeping her alive. As she slowly came to, she muttered words that made Garrett's heart ache. "Thomas, my husband," she whispered, her voice weak and distant. Garrett's stomach dropped. She had no idea. She didn't know that Thomas had died. She didn't know she was alone. Garrett looked down at the letters in her hands, realizing that this was the bride Thomas had been waiting for. But the timing was all wrong. She had come too early. He didn't know what to do, how to tell her the truth. And so, he made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't bear to tell her now. Not like this. Not in the middle of a blizzard, with her barely holding on to life. So he lied. "Thomas is delayed by the weather," Garrett said, his voice rough. "He'll be here soon." The woman, Eleanor Ashford, looked at him with grateful eyes, the faintest spark of hope returning to her gaze. Garrett's heart sank. He had just started a lie that would grow bigger and bigger. He told himself he would tell her the truth in the morning, but he knew that morning would never come. Because the next morning, everything would change. For the next few hours, Garrett worked feverishly to keep Eleanor warm. Her body was freezing, but slowly, with the warmth of the fire and the blankets, she began to regain some strength. She remained semi-conscious, her eyes fluttering open only briefly before closing again. She murmured his name, Thomas, over and over, her voice fragile and distant. Garrett couldn't help but feel a deep sense of guilt. He was lying to her, lying to this woman who had come all this way to marry a man who would never be there. But what choice did he have? She was broken, both physically and emotionally. And so, he kept up the lie, promising her that Thomas would arrive soon. He looked down at the letters she had been clutching so tightly. There were several, all written by Thomas, all filled with promises and dreams of their future together. It was clear that Eleanor had escaped a life of scandal and hardship to find hope in a new life with Thomas. But that hope had been shattered when she arrived to find a grave instead of a groom. As she slept, Garrett sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He couldn't help but wonder how long he could keep up this charade. And more importantly, how long he would be able to keep his heart from falling for her. He made a promise to himself. He would tell her the truth in the morning. But morning was still hours away, and the storm was far from over. And so, Garrett waited, his heart heavy with the weight of the lie he had just begun. The storm raged for days, and Eleanor's condition worsened. By the time the snow had slowed, she was burning with fever, delirious from the cold and the trauma. Garrett was forced to care for her alone, as the world outside seemed to disappear in a haze of white. The heat of the fire was their only ally, and it crackled as if to remind Garrett of the growing danger. He sat by her side day and night, his hands gentle as he wiped the sweat from her brow, his heart aching for a woman who was both a stranger and yet so painfully familiar in her vulnerability. Her fever-induced ramblings were heartbreaking, bits and pieces of her life, memories of a past she couldn't escape. It's my father's partner," she murmured one night, her voice weak but urgent. "He took what wasn't his. I fought back, but they all believed him. I was ruined." Garrett's heart clenched as she spoke of her past, betrayal from her own family, the pain of having no one to trust, and the desperation that had led her to this remote place. She had come to escape it all, to start fresh, to find a new life with Thomas. But now, with Thomas gone, Eleanor had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no hope of ever reclaiming the life she had lost. Garrett had no choice but to continue the lie. He could not tell her the truth. "Not yet. Thomas will come when you're well," he repeated to her, his voice rough with the guilt he couldn't hide. She would ask him about Thomas every day, and every day he would give the same answer, the same lie. It became a ritual, a protective barrier between them. And as Eleanor's fever raged on, so did his growing sense of obligation to her. Days passed, and while Eleanor's fever began to subside, she still seemed a shell of herself. The fever had stripped her of her energy, leaving her pale and fragile, her eyes lost in a haze of confusion. As she recovered, the quiet isolation of the cabin became suffocating, the silence only broken by the crackling of the fire and the occasional conversation that seemed to drift between them like two strangers attempting to bridge a gap that neither of them could quite cross. Eleanor's mind seemed to be working through the fog of her illness, and soon she started noticing small things. She observed the cabin with a sense of curiosity, but also confusion. "I thought Thomas's place was bigger," she said one afternoon as she wandered through the small living area. Garrett's heart stilled for a moment, the weight of the lie threatening to crush him. He had known this moment would come, but he had hoped it wouldn't. "We're in my cabin," he said quickly, trying to steady his voice. "Your place needs repairs. It's not safe." It wasn't true, of course. Thomas had lived in a small, simple cabin, much like this one. But it was easier to lie to her than to explain that Thomas's cabin was now a grave. She looked at him with confusion, but said nothing. Perhaps she was too tired to question further, or perhaps she was simply too lost in the fog of her fevered mind to care. It was only a small crack in the wall of deception, but it felt like a crack in his very soul. He tried to reassure her with kindness, offering little comforts here and there. He helped her get out of bed, teaching her how to cook over the fire. She tried her hand at bread making, and although it was a disaster, the laughter they shared over burnt dough brought a fleeting sense of normalcy to the strange, painful silence between them. She struggled with the simplest tasks, and Garrett, surprisingly patient, helped her with every mistake. "It's okay," he would say, his voice gentle. "You're learning. You're safe here." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. She looked at herself in the reflection of the window one evening, her eyes filled with frustration. "I'm useless here," she said softly, almost to herself. Garrett's heart ached as he watched her struggle, the guilt gnawing at him. She wasn't useless, but the lie that held them together made it impossible for her to see any worth in herself. "You're not useless," Garrett reassured her, his voice firm. "You're learning, and you're safe." His words were meant to comfort, but they only seemed to add to the tension between them. The lie, the constant pretense, it was wearing them both thin. She wasn't stupid. She knew something was off, but the sickness and the isolation left her with little to hold on to. And Garrett couldn't help but feel that he was failing her, failing to be the man she needed, failing to be the person who could ease her pain, failing to tell her the truth. But then one night things shifted. Eleanor, still weak but improving, was sitting by the fire, thumbing through one of the letters she had brought with her. She seemed distant, her fingers tracing the words Thomas had written to her. "He said he'd give me a piano," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "He promised me music, Garrett. I miss it so much. It was the only thing that kept me sane in that place." Garrett's chest tightened at the mention of the piano. He knew how much it meant to her. He had heard Thomas's letter speak of it, how he would bring her a piano when she arrived, a symbol of their new life together. But now, with Thomas dead and buried, the promise was nothing more than a cruel reminder of what could have been. Garrett felt a surge of guilt wash over him. He knew that he could never replace Thomas. But he also knew that Eleanor needed something, anything, to hold on to. And in that moment, he made a decision. "I'll get you a piano," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You'll what?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. He nodded, his jaw set. "I'll get you a piano. I don't care what it costs." The words felt like a betrayal, but they also felt like a promise, one that he would do anything to keep, no matter how it tore at him. Eleanor's face softened, a look of hope blooming in her eyes. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice small, almost afraid to believe it. Garrett nodded again. "I'll make it happen." And for a moment, as she gazed at him with gratitude in her eyes, the weight of the lies seemed to lift, if only for a second. But in that second, he knew that the piano would be the turning point. It would be the thing that brought him closer to her, or tore them apart. As she reached out and gently touched his arm, Garrett felt a flood of emotions overwhelm him. Desire, guilt, hope. Everything in him wanted to pull her close, to comfort her, to tell her the truth. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not while the lies still stood between them. And as Eleanor hugged him tightly, Garrett knew that the coming days would force him to face the truth, whether he was ready for it or not. The promise of a piano had sparked something between them, but it was a promise tied to a lie that couldn't hold forever. The next day, Garrett would have to go into town to order the piano, and when he did, the questions would start. Questions that he couldn't answer, not without shattering the fragile world they had built. The storm outside may have passed, but the storm inside Garrett's heart was just beginning. He knew that soon, Eleanor would have to face the truth, whether he was ready to tell it or not. And as he watched her settle back in her seat by the fire, a deep sense of dread washed over him. She would never forgive him for what he had done. But for now, he would hold on to the fragile hope that the piano would bring her the comfort she needed, the music she longed for, and maybe, just maybe, the truth he was too afraid to tell. The days following Garrett's promise to Eleanor were filled with an uneasy tension, as the weight of the lie hung heavy between them. Eleanor, still recovering but growing more aware of her surroundings, seemed to sense that something wasn't quite right. But Garrett kept up the pretense, masking his guilt with false assurances. As winter continued to melt into the first hints of spring, Garrett knew the time had come to venture into town for supplies and, more importantly, the piano he had promised Eleanor. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she had arrived, and the lie was becoming harder to maintain. He couldn't keep pretending, but he also couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. The morning he left for Elkhorn Bend, the town just a few miles away, the snow had already begun to soften under the early spring sun. The journey was still treacherous, but the roads were passable, and the whole town was still buzzing with talk about Thomas's death. When Garrett reached the mercantile, he was greeted by the familiar faces of the townsfolk, but their smiles were laced with suspicion. Mrs. Pritchard, ever the gossip, eyed him closely as she helped him gather the items he needed. "Heard Thomas died, Garrett," she said with a knowing glance. "His bride ever show up?" Garrett's heart raced. His instinct was to lie again, to say no, but the words caught in his throat. "No, never came," he said instead, his voice sounding far more uncertain than he intended. Mrs. Pritchard didn't seem to notice, but Garrett saw the glint in her eye as she passed him a few goods. He hoped the lie was enough to get him through the town trip without raising any further questions. But just as he thought he had escaped the worst of it, Sheriff Wade appeared, leaning against the counter with a hard look on his face. "You ordering a piano, Garrett?" the sheriff asked, his tone sharp. Garrett froze. The piano. He had ordered it weeks ago, knowing that Eleanor had desperately wanted it. But now, with all the talk swirling about Thomas's death, it seemed like an odd, if not suspicious, choice. Garrett said, forcing a casual tone, "a gift for my wife." The words felt foreign in his mouth, but they were a part of the story he had been building. "A piano, huh?" Sheriff Wade raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were living alone. Thought you said you were just helping out Thomas's bride." Garrett nodded quickly, trying to steer the conversation away from anything more incriminating. "She's been ill. Thought she'd enjoy some music when she's feeling better," he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. The sheriff seemed to buy it, but Garrett noticed the way he lingered a little longer than necessary, studying him with an intensity that made Garrett's skin prickle. He paid for the goods and left in a hurry, the unease lingering in his gut. He couldn't shake the feeling that the questions were starting to pile up. When Garrett returned to the cabin, he found Eleanor sitting by the fire, the faintest trace of worry in her eyes. She had become more aware of her surroundings now, no longer as feverish or delirious as she had been, but the questions had started. "Garrett," she said, her voice tentative, "I found these in the drawer while I was cleaning." She held up a set of papers, documents with his name on them. "Are you and Thomas partners?" "I didn't know." Garrett's heart sank. He had hoped she would never find these papers, his documents, the ones he had kept for himself, personal things, and mostly those related to his land. But now she had found them, and the questions were inevitable. Before he could respond, a sharp knock on the door interrupted them. Garrett's blood ran cold as the door creaked open, and in stepped Preacher Josiah, the last person he wanted to see. "Heard Thomas's bride arrived?" the preacher said with a raised brow, looking over Eleanor, who had risen to her feet. Eleanor blinked, confused, and Garrett felt a cold sweat prick at his neck. "I'm Eleanor Brennan," she said softly, her voice quivering with uncertainty, not fully understanding the situation. Preacher Josiah's face hardened when he heard the name. "Thomas Brennan is dead, ma'am," he said gently, his voice carrying the weight of truth. 2 weeks now. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her face paled, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down as she processed the information. Garrett stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Eleanor's world shattered in an instant, and the guilt Garrett had been carrying for days, weeks, really crushed him. "What's going on here, Garrett?" Preacher Josiah asked, his eyes narrowing. "I thought you said she was waiting for Thomas." Garrett's mind raced. and he felt his heart hammering in his chest. The lies had piled up too quickly, too high, and now they were crumbling before his eyes. He had to act, had to do something, or risk everything being exposed. "She's my wife," he said, his voice rough. "We married quietly." The words felt like nails in his throat. He knew it wasn't true, that Eleanor wasn't truly his wife. Not in the legal sense, not in any sense that mattered. But at that moment, it was the only thing he could say. The preacher's gaze grew sharp. "You've married her? When? Where's the proof?" Garrett felt the walls closing in. He promised to bring papers to prove it, but they weren't real. His lie had just grown too big to control. The preacher left, and for a moment, there was a painful silence in the room. Eleanor stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and hurt. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You lied about Thomas. You lied about everything." Garrett's heart shattered as he saw the hurt in her eyes, the tears welling up that she didn't want to shed. She had trusted him, and he had betrayed her. But there was nothing to do now. The truth was too complicated to fix, and he couldn't take it back. Eleanor's voice trembled as she spoke again. "I have nothing. I came here for marriage. I thought I was starting a new life, but you lied to me. I don't know what to believe anymore." Garrett stood before her, his mind racing, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed to be enough. The words he had been holding back for so long, the truth he had refused to face, felt like a stone in his throat. And then, in the silence that followed, the only thing that came to mind was a desperate plea. "Then marry me," he said, his voice strained but firm. "For real." Eleanor stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" she asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "Marry me," Garrett repeated, stepping forward. "It solves everything. Your reputation, your safety, everything. I'll make it right." She stood motionless, caught in the storm of her emotions. She had nothing left to lose, and the weight of the lie that had already been placed upon her made her answer feel inevitable. "I'll marry you," she said, her voice cold, almost distant, "but don't expect me to forgive you." The words hung in the air, a final declaration of survival in a world that had been torn apart by deceit. The wedding was 3 days away. Neither of them expected the fury of the town that would come with it. The weight of the upcoming ceremony and all the questions that it would raise seemed almost unbearable. But they were bound together by the lies they had both been forced to live, and neither of them was ready to face the consequences of the truth just yet. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with a tense silence, the cold between Garrett and Eleanor only growing colder. The town had heard the news, and whispers spread like wildfire. It wasn't hard for anyone to figure out the basic details. Thomas was dead, and Garrett had married his bride. But the truth was a far more complicated thing, a twisted mess of lies and half-truths that neither of them could unravel. The day of the wedding arrived, and it was as if the entire town had been waiting for it. The small church was filled with townsfolk, but the atmosphere was far from joyful. There were no celebratory smiles, no warm greetings. Instead, there was an air of suspicion that hung heavy in the room, palpable as the cold wind outside. Eleanor stood at the back of the church, her white dress a stark contrast to the dark stare she received from the onlookers. She felt small, insignificant under their judgmental gazes, but she remained still, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined her wedding day would feel like this. Not just the wedding of a woman who had lost her fiancé, but the wedding of a woman whose very presence was seen as a scandal. She wasn't marrying for love. She wasn't marrying for hope. She was marrying to survive. Garrett, standing at the altar, his face stone cold, didn't feel much better. He had never wanted a wedding like this, one built on lies and desperation. But as he looked out at the gathered faces, he saw nothing but judgment. They were all waiting to see him fail, waiting to see Eleanor fail. He couldn't blame them. The whole situation felt wrong. But the alternative was worse, revealing the truth and watching everything fall apart. And so, they stood before the preacher, their vows more like empty promises than heartfelt declarations. Garrett could hardly look at Eleanor as they exchanged the words that bound them together in front of God and the people who would condemn them. When it came time for the kiss, there was no love in it, no passion, no tenderness, just the briefest of touches, a formality to close the chapter of their forced union. The preacher declared them man and wife, but there was no joy in the proclamation. The wedding was over, but the damage had already been done. As they exited the church, the coldness of the town followed them like a shadow. The whispers grew louder, and it was clear to Garrett and Eleanor that there would be no peace in their marriage, at least not for the moment. The sheriff, who had watched the entire ceremony with a critical eye, lingered near the door. "This doesn't sit right," he muttered, his voice low and accusatory. "She consented freely?" Eleanor, who had been silent for most of the ceremony, glanced at Garrett, her face a mask of forced composure. "I'm married willingly," she said, her voice steady but cold. The sheriff didn't seem convinced, but he nodded and turned away, a sign that he was done questioning for the moment. The ride back to the cabin was even worse than the ceremony. There were no words exchanged, just the sound of the wagon wheels crunching over the snow, the silence between them deafening. When they finally arrived, the harsh wind seemed to press in from all sides, as if nature itself was turning against them. Garrett helped Eleanor down from the wagon, but neither of them felt the warmth of the other's presence. Inside, the cold was even worse. The fire in the hearth had long since burned out, and the cabin felt empty, too quiet. They had been married for mere hours, and yet it already felt like their marriage was a lifetime of tension and distance. Garrett went to tend to the fire, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Eleanor had looked at him during the ceremony. The look of a woman who had been forced into something she didn't want. The look of someone who had been betrayed. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had not spoken a word since they had arrived back at the cabin, and she wasn't sure what to say. She had never imagined her life would turn out like this. Trapped in a marriage with a man she barely knew, a man who had lied to her from the moment they met. The resentment she felt toward him was a bitter thing, but there was also something else there, a nagging feeling she couldn't shake. She hated him for what he had done, for the lies he had told, for the way he had used her. But there was also a part of her that saw him differently now, a part that had seen the way he had cared for her when she was sick, the way he had kept her alive when she had nothing left. She hated that part of herself, the part that wanted to believe in him, even though everything he had done had been wrong. As the evening stretched on, they remained in the same room, but it felt like there were miles between them. Garrett tried to make small talk, but Eleanor didn't respond. She wasn't angry anymore. She was just tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the pain. Tired of pretending. She had never been so alone. Garrett, for his part, could feel the distance between them widening with every passing minute. He knew he had hurt her, and he couldn't undo it. But the guilt that weighed on him was unbearable. He had promised her a new life, a fresh start, and all he had given her was more pain. She deserved better than this, better than him. But the thought of letting her go, of telling her the truth, was too much to bear. He couldn't stand the idea of losing her, even though he knew he had already lost her. The days that followed were no better. The harsh winter storms kept them indoors, and the isolation only made things worse. Eleanor went about her duties with a coldness that matched the world outside. She had become distant, mechanical, like a woman who had learned to shut herself off from the world. Garrett tried to break through the ice, to talk to her, to fix things, but every attempt seemed to make it worse. They shared meals in silence. Their only communication, the quiet clink of utensils against plates. The tension was suffocating, and neither of them knew how to fix it. Then, one night, a snowstorm came, trapping them in the cabin for days. The howling wind outside was the only sound that filled the silence between them. The storm was brutal, and they were forced to stay inside, together, with nowhere to escape from the reality they had created. As the storm raged on, Eleanor's emotions broke free. She had been holding everything in for so long, and the storm seemed to crack open the dam of her feelings. She woke up in the middle of the night, shaking with the remnants of a nightmare, her heart pounding in her chest. Garrett heard her scream and rushed to her side, his heart racing. She was trembling, her body cold with fear. He pulled her into his arms, desperate to calm her, and for the first time in days, they were close, too close. Eleanor clung to him, her tears soaking into his shirt as she whispered through her sobs. "I can't do this anymore, Garrett. I can't live like this." Her words broke him, shattered whatever resolve he had left. He had been the one to bring her here, the one who had lied to her, who had stolen her life from her. He had been the one to ruin everything. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry for everything." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The storm outside was still howling, but inside, for the first time in days, there was a flicker of something else between them. A quiet understanding, a fragile connection that hadn't been there before. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but in that moment, they both knew one thing for sure. The lies had brought them together, but it would be the truth that would either tear them apart or heal them. As the storm raged on through the night, neither of them slept. They didn't need to. The silence between them had been broken, and for the first time, it didn't feel so cold. Spring had slowly begun to make its presence known, the once snow-covered land now beginning to reveal patches of green as the earth thawed. But for Garrett and Eleanor, it was not just the seasons that were changing, it was their relationship. The storm had broken something between them, a crack in the ice that had held them apart for so long. Eleanor no longer seemed like a distant stranger to him, and for the first time, Garrett felt a glimmer of hope. The piano he had promised her was delivered just as the first signs of spring appeared, and Eleanor was both stunned and speechless when she saw it. The large freight wagon pulled up to the cabin, and Garrett could see the shock in her eyes as she stepped outside to inspect it. The piano, an elegant darkwood piece, gleamed in the morning light. It was everything she had dreamed of, everything Thomas had promised her. "You really did it," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief as she ran her hand over the polished surface. Garrett, standing behind her, could feel a lump form in his throat. "I said I would," he replied softly, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and guilt. She turned to look at him, a tear slipping down her cheek as she smiled faintly. "Thomas promised me this," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But you kept that promise. I don't know how to thank you for this, Garrett." It was the first time she had looked at him with anything close to gratitude, and Garrett felt a wave of conflicting emotions. The guilt still gnawed at him. He had lied to her, stolen her future, and dragged her into a situation that had destroyed any hope she had for a real life. But in that moment, as she looked at the piano with awe and wonder, he couldn't help but feel that, despite everything, he had done something right. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice tight. "I promised, and I keep my promises." The words felt heavy, loaded with all the unspoken things they had both ignored for so long. Eleanor, her hands still resting gently on the piano, turned to him again. She smiled faintly, her expression softening. "You're not what I thought you were," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett's chest tightened at her words. It was the first real acknowledgement of the change that had been happening between them, the shift in how they saw each other. But before he could respond, Eleanor turned toward the piano, her eyes distant again. "I haven't played in so long," she said, almost to herself, before sitting down at the bench. She ran her fingers over the keys, letting the soft notes fill the silence between them. The melody that emerged was both haunting and beautiful, a mixture of melancholy and hope. Garrett watched her, feeling a strange mix of awe and sadness. The music that had once been promised by another man was now a gift he had given her, but it was a bittersweet gift. She was playing for him, not for the man she had once dreamed of. She finished the song with a soft sigh, and when she looked up at him, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that Garrett hadn't seen before. "I never thought I'd play again," she said quietly. "Not after everything." Garrett moved toward her, his hands trembling slightly. He wanted to say something, wanted to apologize, to tell her that he had ruined everything. But the words stuck in his throat, and all he could do was stand there, watching her. She had come so far, from the desperate woman who had arrived frozen and broken in the snow to the woman sitting before him, playing a song that had once been a dream. But he knew, deep down, that no matter how much they had changed, the lies still stood between them, and he had no idea how to break it. The next day, the town felt different. As the snow finally melted away and the first hints of green began to creep through the earth, the townspeople began to emerge from their homes, eager to resume their daily routines. Garrett and Eleanor decided to make a trip into town together, something they hadn't done since the wedding. It was a small step, but it felt like a big one. Eleanor had grown stronger over the past few weeks, and the idea of going into town with Garrett wasn't as terrifying as it had once been. But neither of them was prepared for the reaction they received when they entered the mercantile. Mrs. Pritchard, ever the gossip, was the first to speak. "Well, if it isn't the newlywed couple," she sneered, her voice thick with judgment. "I suppose congratulations are in order, though I'm sure some folks are questioning just what kind of wedding it really was." Eleanor's face flushed, and for a moment, she looked as if she might break down. But then, to Garrett's surprise, she straightened her back, her eyes hardening. "I don't need your congratulations," she said, her voice steady but cold. "I didn't marry for your approval, Mrs. Pritchard." The words came out stronger than Garrett had expected, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for her. Eleanor had spent so long hiding behind the lies, behind the shame, and yet here she was, standing tall, defending herself against the very people who had torn her down. The rest of the room fell silent, and Garrett felt the weight of the moment. He had expected the town to be hostile, but he hadn't expected Eleanor to defend herself so fiercely. She had come so far, and in that moment he realized that maybe they both had. Just as Mrs. Pritchard opened her mouth to respond, Sheriff Wade stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked between two of them. "There's talk," he said, his voice low, "about Thomas's death. The timing doesn't sit right with some people." Garrett's heart sank. He had known the town would eventually start asking questions, but hearing the sheriff voice those concerns made the reality of it all hit home. "What are you implying?" Garrett asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The sheriff's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he spoke again. "I'm not implying anything, but there are questions. People wonder if Thomas's death wasn't an accident." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Garrett could feel the heat of everyone's gaze on him, but Eleanor, to his surprise, spoke up before he could. "Thomas died before I arrived," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Garrett saved me from the blizzard. We married to protect my reputation, the one you're all destroying with your gossip." The room was silent for a long moment, but then a young woman, Sarah, spoke up. "Mrs. Pritchard preaches morals, but shows none," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of defiance. The words hung in the air, and the people around them began to murmur in agreement. For the first time, Garrett saw a shift in the room. The townspeople, who had been so quick to judge, were beginning to question the narrative that had been pushed on them. The shopkeeper, who had been silent until now, stepped forward and gave Garrett a nod. "You're welcome here, Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice steady, offering a small but significant show of support. As they left the mercantile, Garrett felt the weight of what had just happened sink in. Eleanor had stood up for herself, for them both. She had found her voice, and in doing so, had changed the way the town saw them. The wagon ride home was quieter than before, but there was something different in the air. It wasn't the tension of before. It wasn't the cold distance. It was something softer, something warmer. Eleanor turned to Garrett as they rode in silence. "I defended you," she said softly, almost as if she were testing the words out. "I defended us. A marriage I didn't even choose." Garrett looked at her, his heart racing. "Did you mean it?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I don't know," she said, her voice quiet, "but I said it, and it felt less like a lie than before. For the first time, it felt like a new chapter had begun, one where the lies had lost their power and the truth was beginning to take hold. But just as the storm had passed and the thaw had begun, there was another storm on the horizon, one that neither of them could predict, and one that would force them to face the deepest truths of all. That night, as the sun set over the mountains, the weight of what lay ahead hung heavy in the air. Neither of them knew what the future held, but in that moment, they knew that they had survived the worst of it together. And that, in itself, was a kind of victory. The long winter that had gripped the land for so many months finally started to loosen its hold, and the first stirrings of spring began to appear. The thaw in the earth mirrored the slow, uneasy thaw that had begun in Garrett and Eleanor's marriage. The days were longer now, the air warmer, and yet neither of them could escape the lingering tension between them, the storm that had swept through their hearts as surely as it had torn through the valley. Eleanor had been quiet in the days following the town's confrontation, her defenses still high, though something had shifted in her. She no longer wore the same cold, guarded expression. There was a softness in her gaze when she looked at him, but it was tempered by the weight of everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayal, the pain. She had been through so much, and Garrett knew that no matter what they tried, there was no easy way to erase the damage that had been done. He had hoped that with time, things would settle. He had hoped that their fragile understanding would grow into something more, something genuine. But as the days stretched on and the snow finally began to melt, Garrett knew that time alone couldn't fix everything. It had been weeks since the piano had arrived, and Eleanor had played it every day, filling the cabin with the music that had once been a distant dream. But even as the notes echoed through the walls, the silence between them still lingered. They had been dancing around the truth for far too long, and Garrett knew it was time to face it. It had been a brutal spring storm that triggered the moment. The wind howling through the trees, the skies darkening with clouds, the earth shaking beneath the weight of the storm. The kind of storm that reminded him of the blizzard that had brought Eleanor to him in the first place, the storm that had started everything. Eleanor had been pacing the cabin, her nerves fraying as the storm intensified. Garrett had been working outside, but he could feel the storm gathering inside as well. He had been holding on to the lie for far too long, and the guilt was suffocating. That night, when the winds reached a crescendo and the rain pelted the windows like needles, Eleanor couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. She turned to Garrett, her eyes fierce with the questions that had been building inside her for months. "Why did you really lie to me, Garrett?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and pain. "I need to know. Why did you drag me into this mess? Why couldn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning?" Garrett's heart pounded in his chest. He had known this moment was coming. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside his own mind, a whirlwind of emotions and regrets. He had kept his silence for so long, buried his past, buried the truth of who he was and what he had done. But now, there was no more hiding. He had to come clean. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with the weight of all the things he had never said. "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I didn't want you to leave. When I found you, frozen in the snow, I saw a chance to start over. But I didn't know how to let you go. I couldn't." Eleanor's face twisted in pain as she listened to him. It wasn't the answer she had expected, but it was the answer she needed. The pieces of their twisted puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But even as the truth spilled from his lips, it didn't make anything easier. "I lost my wife," Garrett continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I lost my child too. It broke me. And when you showed up, I saw a way out. I didn't know how to let you go, Eleanor. I thought, I thought if I could just keep you here, I wouldn't have to face the truth of what I had lost. But the truth is, I lied because I was too scared to face it all. His confession hung in air between them, thick with guilt and raw emotion. Eleanor stood still, her eyes fixed on him, her face a mask of disbelief and understanding. She had come here with a purpose, to escape her past, to find something better, something real. But instead, she had walked straight into a lie. She had trusted him, and he had betrayed her. But now, as he stood before her, the man she had been living with for months seemed less like the stranger who had deceived her and more like the broken man who had never been able to heal. I memorized Thomas's letters. Eleanor said, her voice barely audible. I came here for him, for the promises he made me. I thought he was the one who was going to fix everything. But you, she paused, her words caught in her throat. You kept me warm, Garrett. You taught me how to live again, even when you lied to me. I don't know how to reconcile that. Garrett stepped forward, his chest tight with emotion. You don't have to, he said softly. You don't have to forgive me. But I'll tell you this. I've never wanted anything more than to make it right. And I'll do whatever it takes to fix what I've broken. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. She had been through so much: betrayal, loss, shame. But in this moment, she felt the truth settling in. It was messy, it was painful, but it was real. And what if I don't want to be free? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What if I want to stay? What if I want to be yours, Garrett? His heart stopped in his chest. The words felt like a declaration, a promise, but also a challenge. It was a choice, one that neither of them had expected. Garrett reached out, his hands trembling as he touched her face, the warmth of her skin a stark contrast to the cold storm that raged outside. Then stay, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Stay with me. We'll figure it out together. I'll take you anywhere you want to go. But for now, stay with me. And in that moment, the storm that had raged inside them both seemed to settle. The weight of the lies, the hurt, the confusion, it all seemed to fade in the face of the choice that lay before them. Eleanor nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek. I don't know what the future holds, she said, her voice shaking. But I know this. I don't want to be alone anymore. And so, as the storm outside continued to rage, they stood together in the quiet aftermath of everything they had been through. The truth had finally been spoken, and with it came the possibility of a new beginning. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be perfect. But for the first time in a long while, they both believed that maybe, just maybe, they could find something worth holding on to. The roads outside would soon be clear, and with them, the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined before. But for now, they stood together, waiting for the spring to come, waiting for the warmth that would heal them both.